So my company uses Slack quite a bit. We've had it for about 4 years, and now it's the only chat platform we officially support. Most of our 3,000-something employees use it in some way or another. As our organization has grown, Slack has proved useful for connecting teams who aren't all in the same building, city, or maybe even the same time zone. And for many technical discussions, Slack has proved a better zone for them than email, which is where they landed in the past. Now, recently, I've read a number of blog posts about how harmful Slack is for you and your organization. And while I agree that Slack can be a way to easily distract yourself, many of these posts are stuck in cycles of regret and opprobrium. They don't offer any advice. And many of the problems that they highlight are actually very old. Slack is just the latest popular way to find them. Email, IRC, and other instant messaging platforms can distract you just as well. And with some work, I think that you can avoid this. In my experience, happy coexistence with Slack comes, like with so many communication platforms, in adjusting how they're allowed to interrupt you. Consider turning mobile notifications off completely with Slack and limiting notifications on Slack's desktop application. The desktop client also has an option to change what channels it lists. I recommend choosing unreads and starred conversations and starring those that you need to check often or revisit for whatever reason, but most often ignoring or leaving other channels. Mute channels liberally. Now, Slack encourages users to make new channels for different discussion topics, which paradoxically can make conversations both easier and harder to ignore. Depending on how your organization uses Slack, you might find yourself unaware of something important or super distracted. Now, for that reason, you would do well to set guidelines on using Slack with your team and your company. Ask each other questions like, how should you act on discussions that you have in Slack and decisions that come from them? Where else do you need to record the outcome of meetings that you have in Slack? Do you allow people to assign and distribute work within Slack, or will you keep a separate track of that in some other platform like Trello or Jira or something along those lines? You may want to set some guidelines across your entire company, but you should be sure to let each team grapple with these questions themselves. Certain workflows will be better for some teams than others, and giving each group autonomy should increase the chance that anyone follows what they decide. You should also discuss which, if any, of Slack's integrations you want to use and why you need them. Does it help your team to manage, for example, Trello cards within Slack? Should you set guidelines around when and where things like Giphy and XKCD should and should not be used, because they can be great, but they also can be very distracting? My advice there is don't just make Slack another place for alerts from platforms like Datadog and PagerDuty to land. Make sure that the notices you send to Slack are useful and have a purpose. Maybe you want team members to be able to comment on them in real time. Maybe you only want urgent alerts to go there. Talk about this too. Why do you want to send alerts to Slack? If you need to send any, how do you keep a good signal-to-noise ratio? Also talk about how you plan to use Slack during outages. At Red Ventures, we have a NOC team that'll create a channel for outages and invite people that need to be in them, but maybe your strategy won't involve Slack at all. Maybe you want to avoid Slack for whatever reason or do something else. Most important of all, talk about what limits your team wants to set on Slack. Your team might operate in a manner that allows you to have a Slack rotation like you might have an on-call rotation. A couple teams at Red Ventures do this already, and it's made them much more productive for it. You can ask many of these questions about other communication platforms just as you ask them of Slack. How do you use email and Jira, for instance, during outages or for alerts? Slack is not unique in that you need to think about how you'll use it. But Slack is a relatively new platform, which is why I think people question its utility so much, especially in light of the oft-published notion that Slack aims to kill email. In my mind, the two platforms are complementary. Just one is typically more immediate than the other and can be very distracting if you're not careful. I once stood in the camp that holds that Slack is just a worse version of IRC, but I've come to appreciate the features its developers have built. For newcomers, Slack is, in my experience, much easier to use, and it comes with video and voice chat out of the box, which you don't get with something like IRC. And I appreciate critiques of Slack, but I'm often at odds with their dismal language. Any tool like Slack runs the risk of being misused in the ways that they describe. It's the policies that you set around that that will determine whether or not that happens. Thanks for listening, everybody, and if you're interested in seeing any of this in the future, there are some links for you.